Welcome everyone to the weekly town hall hosted by the Utah League of Cities and Towns and the Utah Association of Counties. I'm Cameron Dale, the director of the league, and my co-host Brandy Grace will be joining us momentarily. She's the CEO of the Association of Counties. We are thrilled today to be joined not only by the Lieutenant Governor, Spencer Cox. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for continuing our weekly tradition.
I'm always happy to be here, Cam.
But we are also thrilled today to be joined by Kristen Cox, who is the Director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and who has been spearheading the work of Utah Leads Together. So Chris, thank you very much for joining us today as well.
Thank you, Cameron.
Well, Lieutenant Governor Cox, we usually start by talking basketball of some sort. I don't know about you. I was pretty devastated to hear about Bogdanovich's wrist injury. At this point, the NBA might as well just stay suspended and let's run it back next year, right?
I would be supportive of that. It's looking a little bleak, and not only that, but I've had to watch our most painful Utah Jazz memories a couple times this week, and I'm good to be done with that. So, anytime. Yeah, you're still a stronger man than I. That you hate watched the last dance. I still can't bring myself to do it. At some point, probably, but not yet. So now that we got the basketball out of the way, let's chat about where we're at. We are yellow with a shade of orange around the state. And so, Lieutenant Governor, I'll turn the time over to you and Chris to talk about not just where we're at, but where we're going. Well, thank you, Cam. It's great to be with all of you. I apologize that I'm doing this via audio only. I am traveling. I was just driving downtown, Cameron.
In fact, he was driving downtown and apparently went into a dead zone. So it looks like we've momentarily lost the Lieutenant Governor. I guess that's what I get for starting with basketball. So Chris, let's go to you while we wait for the Lieutenant Governor to call back in. Tell us where we're at and where we're going and what to expect from Utah Leads Together 3.0 when it comes out. And Chris, you are still muted. So yeah. There you go.
Okay, there you go. I hate this mute, unmute world that we live in right now. So first of all, yeah, Cameron so and Brandy, it's so true. It's the most commonly used phrase. Can you hear me? But first, I want to acknowledge Cameron, you and Brandy. We feel like you guys are great partners and you are good brokers. You're very collaborative and you challenge us, which is what we need. So tomorrow, the governor is going to be releasing, and Lieutenant Governor, Utah Leads Together 3.0. It's basically an update on stabilization phase. And it's just to give everybody a kind of an overview. When we started this, we had 3 phases. For that, we got it
somehow,
in 5 weeks, and then.
Yeah, there we go. You're good. Continue.
There we go. Are we good?
Yep. Nope, you muted yourself again.
So yeah, I'm not muting my. So we hit that really quickly, and we're very aggressive. And that urgent phase was a lot of scaling, a lot of infrastructure, just speed, so we could get out of that. Because we all know, that we can't just look at public health. We have to look at public health and the other impacts to society and the economy. So we know that speed is everything in this game. So now we're in stabilization, and as you mentioned, Cameron, most of the state is in yellow with a few exceptions. And the stabilization update is going to focus on how we're working and going to be addressing at-risk populations specifically. And we'll touch upon a few other themes, including planting the seeds for economic recovery. How do we deal with job attach? So those 70% who are furloughed don't lose that job attachment. How do we deal with continued claims and unemployment insurance? Those are the folks we really want to help get some short-term solutions around. And then the longer-term opportunities. You hear this a lot from the governor and lieutenant governor. What's the silver lining? What are the opportunities we can be brought? And I think there are some really good mega trends we can look at. And we'll start talking about those as we gear up for economic recovery.
Well, Chris, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that overview. Can Can you
Yeah.
talk through the core 4 health indicators?
Sure.
Because one thing the Lieutenant Governor has stressed on these calls over the last few weeks is that Utah is a very data-driven process, and we aren't moving from color to color on a whim. We're moving from color to color based on some really important health data that we're collecting.
Yeah, one of the first things, probably so many of us experience this, right? Legislative session ends and then you think you have a break and bam, this hit. But we knew in the first week, if we didn't get really good data that was statewide, that it could also be dissected at the local level, we are just going to be flying blind. And I think a lot of states are still actually struggling with that. For example, we call it the core 4. What is our hospital capacity? And because that's so much of what this has been geared around, is how do we protect and not overwhelm our healthcare system so that there's not a crisis and people can get access to the care they need. We average right now about 10 to 11% of our COVID ICU capacity, the capacity that people have designated for COVID, is utilized. And that's actually, it was at a high of almost 17%, it's come down. Overall hospital ICU capacities over 50%, but that's including COVID, non-COVID. And hospitals normally are higher than that in normal times. Still a lot of capacity in the overall system. So that's one measure we really watch closely, and we can break it out by kind of a local health department. I think of the hospital basin like a water basin, where there's hospital capacity that's shared across entities or counties. We also look at what we call exposure point. Where does the virus seem, where are people getting contaminated or picking this up? Is it from a super spreader? Is it from a known contact, or is it just somewhere in the community? Good news is that for the most part, we've been pretty consistent of a known contact. So it's not just random in the community. What we're doing now is digging in deeper. We're going to be picking up occupational data, super spreader data, and a few more what we call small areas, so we can even refine into specific areas where we're seeing outbreaks. So that's additional data we'll be picking up in the next week or so on exposure point. But so far, we've done pretty well. We look at a lot of operational data. This is one core for it, just operations, but two of the key ones we look at are the positivity rate. So when we first started this journey back in March, the whole month of March, we only did 13,000 tests. For April, we've done about 100,000. And testing is key if we want to open things up and protect hospital capacity and the welfare of our people. So standing at testing volume. So we look at the testing and how much we think. For example, we're doing about 126 tests per 100,000. Harvard came out, we're one of 9 states that has what they think is minimum, which is just over 60 tests per 100,000. So we're doing well. Some areas of the state are doing better than others. And it's just the way we get proactive. We got to run faster than the virus can. And so we can find it, contain it, until we can, just keep opening up this economy. So that's really key. And then we look at positivity rate. As we get to some really level testing capacity, then we start looking at how many people test positive over time. And that number has gone down. We were at 6, 4, 4.5. So that's also a good sign. And again, we can break it out by county. That's really important. And then the other last one I'll just touch upon is called the transmission rate, which is, pass along rate. I get it, I infect 3 other people. When this started back in March, we needed an objective way to say, look, how can we say we're out of urgent and can start normalizing some of our practices? And we needed an objective measure. It was a transmission rate. If it goes 3, you can get exponential growth. I get it, I infect 3, those 3 people infect 3, and it becomes so out of control that it becomes very difficult to get back from that. So we had a target to get to transmission rate of 1. We hit that in 5 weeks, and we really stay right around 1. We go down 0.9, 1.2. You're going to sometimes bump up to 1.5 and back down. As long as we are looking at trend and we don't move into exponential, we also watch that pretty carefully as well. So that's an example of the kind of data we look at. Different parts of the state have different challenges, but for the most part, Utah's doing pretty well compared to where we could be.
Terrific, and certainly compared to what we're seeing in neighboring states and around the country, and that's both on the health side and on the economic side. Lieutenant Governor, welcome back. That's what we get for talking a little trash about the Jazz, is we got a technological issue that jumped up and bit us. So thank you for calling back in.
Thanks, Cam, and my apologies. It's done this to us a couple times, and sometimes the automated lady just says goodbye and hangs up on me. So we'll try to stay on this time. Perfect.
Well, in your absence, Chris was walking through the core 4 and the data that you've been evaluating as the governor has moved the majority of the state from orange to yellow. One thing that we know that will be coming out in the 3.0 document later this week that Chris referenced is a focus on the high-risk populations. I really liked the quote last week about how COVID-19 is a bully and really seeks after those who are high risk. And certainly the data that we've seen thus far on fatality rates really does zero in on those high-risk populations. So what should people expect from 3.0, and what should people be doing to help take care of the high-risk population?
Well, thank you, Cam. And Chris, I'm going to let Chris fill in the details here, but I just want to say this by way of introduction. I know I missed the first part, but what I wanted to do was just to let people know, and you've already heard the expertise that Chris brings to our team. We share a last name. We are not related, which is good for her. But Chris is just incredible, and she and her team have really been at the forefront of helping us drive through the operationalizing what we needed to do. The difference between us and every other state is everyone knew what they needed to do. We needed more testing, and we needed contact tracing. We needed all of these things, but not every state has someone like Chris, who's an expert in operationalizing those things and helping us drive to that point. And so as we sat down again in the barrier on one of the first meetings I had with Chris, I was so happy because she got it when so many people weren't driven, that we had to increase our testing capacity, and that was our way through. Now, what we have to do is we have data. We didn't have that before. This novel virus was new. We didn't know much about it. There's still things we don't know, and we're learning about it. But one of the things that we do know is who it attacks and who is the most deadly. With everything we do in life, there is risk, right? When we get in our cars, we drive. When we send our kids to school, there is risk. But as human beings, there's only so much risk that we're willing to take. And we don't know exactly where that is with this disease, but what we know is that the risk is just too high with people that are over the age of 65 and have these underlying health compromised issues, the comorbidities. And so what Chris has done is really been able to dive into the data to find out who is at risk, who's the most at risk, and what are some things that we can do to protect those people so that we keep everyone else safe. And really, when you look at, we talk a lot about, those who have or certain segments of the population, specifically our multicultural communities that are also seeing much higher rates of infection. For example, our Latino community, they make up about 14% of the state, but they're over 30% of the hospitalization. That's an issue, right? And so we've got to work closely with that. We put together a team, a subgroup that's working directly on those issues. We know that we have a huge outbreak on the Arizona side, but certainly on the Utah side as well. So how do we protect those vulnerable populations? And that's what Chris and her team and so many others have been working on. So Chris, I'll let you dive into the details there.
Okay. Well, thank you. And we're doing this under the, Lieutenant Governor and the governor have pointed the direction, and then we just do what they ask. But, the Lieutenant Governor gets credit for the focus on especially multicultural issues. So let's talk about the at-risk population. I think everyone's probably seen the CDC guidelines. I wish it were just quite so simple. There's health factors, there's social factors, but there's also just kind of categories operationalized. How do you do it? Like, how do you reach these people? So there's different categories. One are people who are at risk and still have to work. Somebody who's 40 has had cancer, chemotherapy, autoimmune problems, but they still got to work. What does that person do? What does somebody do who's 65 and older but doesn't have any natural supports? No family support, kind of isolated, can't get food. That's a whole, and I'll talk to how we're addressing those. Another group are people who are under state regulation or oversight. Long-term care facilities, we regulate the prison, developmental center, a state mental health hospital, where we've got some direct stewardship. And then, of course, people who work with all of these individuals in our long-term care facilities. So we we've kind of bunched these because each one kind of creates its own unique strategy. So, you know, the people who are at risk and have to work, we've been working with workers' comp and OSHA and UI to send out a lot of information with the chamber, getting all of that translated into different languages. We'll be working with some groups that work directly with minority populations as well, to say, how do you protect your whole workforce so that the people who are at risk can safely work? And if they can telework, great. If they can't, what are our options? And what are the federal requirements so people know what they can or can't do? The other population of that's 65 and older, and I'll talk about some data in a second, we're working with the AAAs. They got CARES Act funding. They have case management systems. They've got natural relationships with non-for-profits, local governments. So we're have stood that up, and that will be an entity across the state that will support people who don't have access to family or friends. There's been an effort to also reach out to faith-based organizations to look out for these individuals as well. We're serving now probably 20,000. It could go up to 70, so we'll watch those caseloads and we can bring in a volunteer network and other people as needed as those ramp up. And we love it because we hope those groups can support and be very proactive working with local governments. And long-term care facilities, so far we've had 0 outbreaks in the prison, knock on wood, but we have an opportunity to shore up some, I wouldn't say gaps, people have done a good job, but it's process improvement ongoing, some areas where we can shore up long-term care facilities and where some of these really vulnerable people are. And then a big outreach, and the Lieutenant Governor's led on this with multicultural. How do we get money, resources, information? We've put money in for community supports to work with minority populations or folks that are just disadvantaged because of access to information, healthcare, et cetera. So there's a lot going on in that space, but then you look at just the health factors. I mean, everyone has a responsibility to take care of each other, right? I have a stepdad who's super high risk, and I have a responsibility to make sure he's protected when I visit him. But we have seen, if you have diabetes in some cases with certain ages, you could be 250% more likely to be hospitalized. So once we start digging into this data, it helps us even become more surgical in our approach. So we can partner with nonprofits or associations that work with people with diabetes or kidney failure. Or if somebody has that, how do we flag? Because we know that could be, pretty devastating if they're hospitalized. So as we get more data, which we've just been working with Health on and have some good data that we'll be sharing in the plan tomorrow, that gives us more insight. We have a medical panel that stood up with all the chief medical officers that will run all this by and get feedback from them on what are the best interventions and strategies to attack some of these issues. So it's becoming more and more surgical, more and more precise about where, how, and with whom do we intervene, and speed. It's all about excellent execution. If we do really, really well in the next 4 weeks, 2 weeks with execution, at-risk populations, testing, as Lieutenant Governor said, he was ahead of the curve on that. I think we can still continue doing a good job in the state.
Terrific. Thank you, Chris. Brandy, your question.
What do we know about the demographics of those who have died?
You will see about 3 boring tables of data tomorrow. And if we don't get it all in the plan, we'll have it separate for you to look at. But we do know if you have between 15, 24 to 45, if you really don't have any other of these comorbidity underlying issues, very, very low probability of hospitalization. And the Lieutenant Governor said we're not in a zero risk environment. We're at about what level of risk can we live with. We do know that minority groups tend to have higher infection rates, and not just the Latina groups, but Pacific Islanders actually have some higher rates. We know people over 65 actually are impacted the most, and if they're over 80 or 65 and have kidney disease or diabetes or more of these underlying issues, they are much, much more susceptible. So we've sliced the data now by age, by health, and then we're overlaying that by minority population, Pacific Islanders, et cetera, so we can start seeing the nexus of all of this. But those are some of the demographics we see right now. No comorbidity, it's not risk-free, but not as much risk. But if you have these other factors, but we're seeing diabetes right now. When you control across all age levels, diabetes kind of stands out. So we've got to dig into that, type 1 or type 2. And if you're on your medication, does that make a difference? And that's why we're going to need the medical panel to help us design strategies around that.
One thing that is fascinating about 3.0 is that we are not just looking at hospitalization rates, we're not just looking at economic impacts, but we're collectively in Utah looking at all of the far-reaching impacts of COVID-19. So I, for example, serve on the housing subgroup. There's data that the state has been collecting over the last few weeks on everything from traffic counts to behavior changes, crime, consumer confidence, mental health, education. What can you tell us, what can the two of you tell us of what you've been learning, what will be in 3.0, and what you've been learning around these far-reaching impacts of COVID-19 in our community?
Yeah, thanks. This is a really critical question, and any good policy making, we mentioned how hard it was to make good policy decisions when we didn't have data on the disease, and so we were left to look at other countries and what was happening across the world, and then what was happening in New York. But that's just one side of the story, right? And so these false choices that we're always presented that we reject, are you choosing between the economy and health? Well, we had a great call yesterday with the President of the United States, President Trump, and Vice President Pence, and Dr. Fauci, and others, Dr. Birx, where we talked about it's not a choice between health and the economy. It's a choice between health and health. And we know that there have certainly been negative health consequences because of the response to the coronavirus. And so when we're weighing risk, we need to weigh the risk of all of those events. A couple, that we can highlight, we did know that mental health was going to be an issue from the very beginning. And so we stood up mental health resources, and we're grateful for everyone that is working on that particular issue. But another one, domestic violence. A lot of domestic violence is reported by school teachers, and by not having kids in school. Now, obviously, this is an issue every summer, so it's not that this never happens. It's just happens longer, and so we have to be careful, again, not to skew the data the other way. But it is a problem, and it's an issue. And the health consequences of losing a job and the stress, increase in opioid addictions and suicides, all of that data is important in helping us make decisions as we move forward, and in our issues that we've been working on for a long time. So Chris and her team and others have been really engaged in looking at those issues too. So Chris, go ahead.
Sure. You summed it up. I love what he said. We get into this false choice, and I think that's lazy thinking. I think real innovation is when you solve it for all parties. You don't just shift the problem, and that's harder, but I think it's essential. And for example, higher education, we're seeing in some of our institutions enrollments down. They're working hard to bring those back up so people feel safe, and you'll see in this plan a signal to go back to school in the fall for higher ed and K through 12, and all the planning that's in the works to make that happen in a safe way with contingency plans. So all of those issues are true. We've seen people who needed elective surgeries. I think that's why the governor and lieutenant governor went quickly and aggressively to open up elective surgeries. That was one of the first things that opened up to avoid some of those long-term chronic health care issues. So we're watching all of this, and that's why the sooner we can normalize things while protecting against the virus, we can mitigate these underlying issues. I think in the weeks and months ahead, as the dust settles and we see what happens with the economy and other factors, we'll know where else we need to intervene. The challenge is we all know the budget and revenue. And there's CARES Act funding, and I'm sure at the local levels you guys are seeing some of this interesting data as well. How do we prioritize and make sure we shore up safety net programs in the middle of all this? And we're going to need to turn our time and attention into shoring that up and making sure with limited money or with shrinking revenue, or maybe not as much as we expected, that we still deliver top-notch services to the folks who are vulnerable. And I know we can do that. It's just going to take some work.
Chris, do you have any data specific to kids with type 1 diabetes?
No, Brandy, that's the one I want. So you just read my mind. There's kids, by the way, we're doing large-scale field testing, and we'll have some results about prevalence in a couple weeks. But we're going to start going in and looking at the student population so we can prepare for the fall what this looks like. But with, no, I want type 1, type 2, and then for kids, if they're type 1, we know there's kids, we can break it out by age bracket and start seeing what that looks like. So I hope that that evolves in the next week or two.
Good. That was actually a question that came up in the chat from Jan Groberg, but since you had touched on diabetes, I wanted to just grab that one.
And I don't want anyone to, you know, panic or take anything else. All of the issues that are listed with CDC right now, we need to take seriously and make sure those at-risk populations are protected. And then in the weeks ahead, as we get more information from the medical panel, we can continue to hone our intervention.
Thank you. What is the plan around state stimulus, the investment in the labor force and in shovel-ready infrastructure projects?
Lieutenant Governor, you want me to take
Go
that
ahead,
one?
Chris. Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so we do expect over time the state will get between $10 and $12 billion of federal stimulus, which is a lot when you consider our total GDP to be over 170 billion. So it's, you know, it's a pretty significant investment. That's a combination of the PPP loans, UI, money that went to public transit, et cetera. But as many of you guys know, the state's portion was 1.2 billion. The 315 went out to Utah County and Salt Lake County, and the goal is, we've all agreed, and appreciate Brandy and Cameron's and others' negotiations on this, to distribute the other 246 to counties and cities. You guys know all this, I'm sure, 50%, 50%. When you subtract all that, you're left at about 688. Legislature appropriated about 80 million this last session for rental assistance, agricultural support, et cetera. And there's been about 108, 110 so far spent on the public health response, although we believe most of that will be FEMA reimbursed, so, which is good news. So there'll be significant money left on the table. There's a plan to be in special session towards the end of June, and the legislature, the lieutenant governor, governor, and others working on utilities together will start talking about what are those economic stimulus things. Now, by shovel ready, there's projects that we already have in the works that we just bonded last week, by the way, for some roads and et cetera, and we can only bond what we were authorized for. But there's higher ed buildings, there's projects that have already been authorized through revenue bonds or traditional bonding that we can go ahead, and I would count those as shovel ready. Projects like there's discussion about, you know, outdoor infrastructure and stuff like that, which is super exciting. That will take some time to stand up, but I think they'll start getting much more clarity. We will as well. The good news is we're having these discussions now. It's not just virus, virus, virus. Lieutenant Governor and the governor are pushing and talking about economic recovery. And I think in the next couple of weeks, those ideas will materialize. Derek Miller, who's kind of running under the Lieutenant Governor's Task Force, the Economic Recovery Group, is starting to bring people together to formulate a bunch of opportunities. So there's no details yet, but there'll be money on the table for a couple special sessions to consider those things.
Good. Thank you, Chris.
One thing for both Chris and the Lieutenant Governor to know, and just as information for everyone attending the town hall, is that both the leadership of UAC and the League have been working on a joint letter that we'll be distributing in the next day or two to state leaders around partnering on this economic stimulus package. Local governments are seeing the same impacts from the reduction in gas tax revenue that the state is. We're seeing the same impacts of the sales tax reductions. And so we want to partner with the state to make sure that we are taking the dollars, whether we're the dollars that we receive from the federal level, dollars from bonds, or any other potential lever that we can pull on a policy side, and collaborate together to stimulate the economy and meet those infrastructure needs that we have all over the state. So watch for that letter. And then just for everyone attending, the League board met yesterday. I know UX officers were meeting as well, and as we put the finishing touches on that joint letter.
Cam, thank you for that. I just want to add something. You know, this is a really good time. We'll see what happens at the federal level. There's more talk about infrastructure. I don't know. It seems like every week's infrastructure week back at the federal government, but I think they might be serious about it this time. And what's really interesting, and again, to point out and just underscore something that Chris said, so you may have seen the news that Utah has maintained its AAA bond rating. It's a really big deal, especially as we look towards some of these projects. It's a great time to get it done. I was talking with some people in the construction industry that were bidding out some big projects. It may have been a school actually, and the bids came back at 10% below what they were expecting and where they were just a couple months ago. So a lot of the reductions are already being baked into to these projects, but that means that we can do some of these projects that need to be done and save taxpayers significant dollars. Chris mentioned that there was some bonding that we did last week. Treasurer Damshin and I, there were two of the three people on the state bonding commission, and we closed that bond because of our AAA bond rating, because the state was so prepared, and because we were able to get to market so quickly in this pandemic. In fact, we were the first state, I think, to go to market on a bond since all the craziness happened. But we were able to bond at the rate we got was 1.156%, I think, under 1.2%. It's the lowest rate in the history of the state. And it shows how amazingly prepared our state is. The legislature, Chris and her team, the governor's office of management and budget, the ability to work together on these things and move so quickly, but take advantage of these market conditions that will allow us to accomplish things that we're planning to do anyway, that the taxpayers want us to do anyway, but to do it in a way that saves the taxpayers a significant amount of money over time, and at the same time is creating jobs as the workforce is employed in making these things happen. So there are some silver linings, and that's certainly one of them.
Well, that's terrific news and really phenomenal insight. And again, we look forward to collaborating with state leaders. You mentioned how every week seems to be infrastructure week in DC and nothing ever happens. Well, at the state and local level in Utah, every week truly is infrastructure week. That's what we all do. And so it's awesome to have that partnership with the state. Lieutenant Governor, my next question deals with the current order. I mentioned before that we are in a state of yellow with a shade of orange, but that order does expire. Soon. There are some portions of the state that are in orange that are being reevaluated. So it's a two-part question. Part one is what's the process and potential timing for those areas in orange potentially transitioning, as well as the overall state yellow transitioning potentially to green. And then there's been a lot of questions around the legality of enforcing the order. There have been a couple of high-profile examples of that, one in Kaysville, one in Utah County. There's several in southern Utah. So what can you tell us around the enforcement of or what do you want local government leaders to know about the enforcement of the existing order? So the first part of the question is around the timing, particularly the current orange communities, and then the second half of the question is around enforcement.
Sure, thank you. We appreciate the great collaborative work that is happening with the cities and counties, and I understand how difficult this is as we're all trying to figure our way through this. What I can say is that the governor and the commission and others that are involved in these decisions really do appreciate local input, and so if you are one of the communities that is still in orange, it's likely that you requested to remain in orange. And so if you're interested in moving to yellow, what I would say is, and again, we're really following the same same process that we talked about probably almost every call, and that is local elected officials meet with their local health departments and make a recommendation to the state health department. That can happen at any time. So I wouldn't hesitate if you think if you're ready to go yellow, please do that. What will be happening is every 2 weeks, the state will be reevaluating kind kind of from a global perspective where we are and if we need to move. The 2 weeks I mean, there's nothing magical about 2 weeks. It's not set in stone. But it does happen to coincide with what we know is the incubation period for this disease. I mean, some people can come in contact with it, and 2 days later they've got the disease, but others it can take up to 14 days. And so the reason that almost everything we've done from the beginning, and most states and countries have done this on kind of 2 week timeframes, is to allow us to know how a decision we make one day, it's very frustrating, but it's just the nature of this disease, to figure out if what we did had an impact. You have to wait 2 weeks to figure out if it had an impact for good or bad, completely. And so that's just kind of the general framework for what we've been doing. And so the governor will continue to reevaluate, again, with recommendations from local government and from local health departments, and that's a really big deal. Now, as far as enforcement of the orders go, look, we're all in this together, and we're trying to figure this out. And we're for health, and we're for the economy, and we're for the First Amendment, and we're for all of these things. What we're really trying to do is just that balance of keeping people safe, but also stimulating economic opportunity. And so, yes, we would prefer, obviously, for people to follow the recommendations and the orders that have been put out. We're relying on local counties and local public health officers to make those decisions ultimately, though. We really do care about local control and local enforcement. And look, there's going to be situations where things don't match up perfectly, as we can't think through every situation. And we allow that leeway for local leaders to decide and make the best decision with the information that they have. And so we're all in this together. We're not looking for ways to penalize people, but we hope everybody will try to give everyone else the benefit of the doubt a little bit. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit more about moving to green?
Yeah, I think so. And I want to kind of reinforce one thing the Lieutenant Governor said. Utah was just one of 4. Now, this is what I reviewed, so let's just maybe give me a confidence interval range of a couple. But let's say we're one of 4, one of 5 states that did not have a mandatory order, stay at home, stay safe, right? Where we see another. And so we're just one of a few, and we were one of the first to come back. While the economic damage is significant, and we, understand that, Utah is just a unique state. We have awesome people. We have awesome leaders in local government, our legislators. We just have a great state. So I just want to reinforce that this has been an approach from the administration that very much honors and respects local control, and that input from them on these decisions is huge. As I've been watching these conversations and been involved in them. Going to green, so as Lieutenant Governor said, there's this model that we looking at those core 4, and Friday at midnight, that new order took effect, and most of the state went to yellow with a few orange. So now I just reviewed the data again this morning. We're reviewing it to see what it looks like in the next week, 7, 8, 9, 10 days. And we'll start providing information to Governor, Lieutenant Governor. Jeff Burton over health is just instrumental in all of this. He's the guy, you guys know the process. We'll start evaluating again next week and looking at consultation with other local health departments. Jeff reaches out, Burton, to all of you guys and start making recommendations for what looks like it could go green. Data informed, we have to use judgment and discernment, but if it looks like it can go and we hold steady and strong. Today, again, the measures look pretty good. There's differences across the state a little bit, but the thing to stay so good at in the next 2 weeks, so good at, is this at-risk population and just really good execution with our contact tracing and testing. We have health departments that are working super hard. We know that if there's things they need, we want to collaborate and support them. They're on the ground, boots on the ground. We can just be super good. I was talking to one of our labs today. We need to get our turnaround within 24 hours or less. If somebody's positive, we need to find that quickly. And there's just a few little tweaks like that we need to make to shore this up. So I feel optimistic. No guarantees, but I feel very optimistic about most of the state.
And let me just a little context around what Chris said. So there was a new study that was done today that showed that that Utah had the as far as ranking the states, we were the 5th fewest restrictions on the economy, or put another way, there were 45 states that had more restrictions than the state of Utah. And when you combine that and the economic piece of this, as the U.S. Chamber noted, we won't get final unemployment numbers for April until Friday, but the U.S. Chamber said that they believe, at least looking at the raw data, that we're one of only 2 states that will have under 10% unemployment, assuming we hit that number. But we're at the bottom, bottom 3 or 4 regardless. That's really amazing. And then when you add that to the hospitalization rates and the mortality rates, you put those things together. Utah is the best state by far. It's not even close when you look at the rankings in those different categories. And so I put that out there not to highlight anything that we've done, but it really is the response of Utahns in being smart, and it's getting to green and getting to normalcy. Is the thing that's going to make that happen is that we slow the spread of this virus, and specifically not just slowing the spread, as Chris mentioned. There's some nuance there now. People getting the virus isn't a bad thing as long as they don't go to the hospital and die, right? And so by protecting the people who are most likely to go to the hospital and die, then the actual rates or the case numbers aren't quite as critical. Now, again, it's just a numbers game. The more people that have it, the more likely it is that someone with an underlying issue is going to get it and end up in the hospital. So we still want to be careful. But if we're protecting those vulnerable populations, and if we're doing the very things that are recommended in these color-coded movements, we'll be more likely to get the green. And so while the very thing that could prevent us from getting there is sometimes celebrated, if that makes sense. So again, be smart. We're not trying to demonize anyone. We appreciate the strong feelings that people have about these issues. But if we can do things, if we can wear masks in public, and we can wash our hands, and we can stay 6 feet apart, and we can really protect the vulnerable, and get this contact tracing where it needs to be, as Chris mentioned, then we'll get to green sooner. And that's where we want to be.
Mm-hmm. I think what Utah's approach is different is that there's not like a silver bullet strategy. It's about scale and speed. Like, you can't compromise and be kind of halfway about this stuff. You've got to go really fast and really aggressive. And I think Utah's done a good job on that. Not perfect, but pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have time for one more question, and I'll turn it over to Brandy to ask that question. There are a couple other questions in the chat box, and so Brandy and I will stay on for a few minutes after the Lieutenant Governor and Chris leave to answer the questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat box. But Brandy, your question to take us home.
Thanks, Cam. I know it's a little bit early, but I'm sure that there's conversation. Can you tell us what the current thought process is around schools in the fall, K through 12 and higher ed?
Yeah, our thought process is to plan on it. That's our goal. That's what everybody's moving towards. I was just on with Superintendent Dixon this morning. We've been talking with higher ed, and we're driving towards that, and asking them to prepare as if it were happening. So now, obviously, there could be, this changes every day, and there could be spikes, and things could change. But the direction we're headed, we feel very confident. The direction that the treatments are headed, the potential for treatments, and better testing, quicker testing, cheaper testing that allows us to really screen people. All of those things, there's so much at stake that over the course of June, July, and August, there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to get to a place where people can go back to school. And I know that's what Chris is driving to as well.
Yeah, there's plans in place with higher ed. The plan tomorrow will touch and point in that direction. It's interesting in this whole area. There's we can focus on the problem or we can focus on the opportunity. And I'm not saying, we're not naive, we're focused on the problem, but in the middle of this, there's kind of a mindset. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be? And then what will it take to get there? And that's the mindset I think so many stakeholders have now with education. We know where we want to be. Now let's reverse design how we're going to get there. And I'm confident that the state will pull it off.
And Lieutenant Governor and Chris, just as a follow-up there, you're also talking about the accommodations in those school buildings, correct? So similar to what the recommendations are for businesses, you're having those conversations now with school leaders about how to have, proper health needs.
Yeah, it's the same guidelines they have here they're looking at, but things could be different in the fall. We could be super bright green, like totally in the recovery, or you could have parts that have flipped back to orange. And so they're making normal plans, contingency plans, using the color-coded system in higher ed, and then education looking at similar contingency plans. But like with higher ed, they're already requesting that we set aside some testing for them in the fall. Lieutenant Governor said we may have saliva testing or things like that, or cheaper, more ubiquitous. So we're going to have a very agile, nimble plan for testing as we progress for the fall semester.
Yeah, Cam, and to your point, making sure that that students and teachers who may be at higher risk, that we accommodate them and make sure that they're not, put in a vulnerable situation, again, depending on what we have as far as treatments or a vaccine as we come back in the fall. Maybe just a quick note to everybody that's listening. On our call with the president yesterday, there was some media around this, so you probably saw it, but Dr. Fauci, who is traditionally very conservative when it comes to his excitement, about projections or treatments. They are the results of the first human vaccine trial have come back very positive. In fact, what they found was that even at the lowest doses tested, significant antibodies were built up in human test subjects, and so that's huge news. Now there's still a long way to go on that, but because it's been so successful, that the federal government is doing something I don't think they've ever done before. In fact, I'm confident they haven't, and that is that they are actually ramping up production of vaccines that have not been through all the phases of testing, so that if they do pass all of the phases of testing, we already have doses, millions of doses that we can start giving to our most vulnerable, and we can increase production. Now, it's a little bit of a risky move, as we've certainly learned here in the state of Utah. The media loves to hammer you for things that you do in the moment to try to solve something at the end if it doesn't work out the way you expected. They could build these facilities and produce all of this vaccine and then find out it doesn't work. But that's a chance we're willing to take, and it's a chance we absolutely should take because of the damage that's happening both from a health standpoint and an economic standpoint. It makes sense to invest in these technologies and these advancements early, so that if they do pass the trials, we're ready to go. But it's great news for our country, and we're hopeful that, when they start talking about potential for a vaccine for the most vulnerable this fall, versus what we were hearing 18 months to 2 years, that's a huge deal, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed on that one.
Terrific. Well, that's great news to finish our conversation on. So thank you very much for that. Brandy and I will stick around for a couple of minutes to answer the other questions in the chat box. But Lieutenant Governor and Chris Cox, or Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and Chris Cox, the Director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, thank you both very much for joining us today.
Yeah, look forward to continuing.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Chris.
Work and collaboration. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you both. And now we can quickly hit these other questions. Brandy asked the question around schools and classes. So Brandy, I'll hit Mayor KJ's, and then you can hit Garth, and we'll just quickly run through the last questions here.
Okay.
Mayor KJ, the Open and Public Meetings Act anchor requirements are suspended through June 30th. And when we are in the state of yellow, I know of some local governments that have been that have transitioned back to in-person meetings. Most have not. During yellow, it is possible with appropriate social distancing, but a lot of that depends on what your city hall or county commission chambers look like. For most communities, I know they're waiting until green or until they get additional guidance, and that executive order is in place through June 30th. We're having dialogue with the legislature about potentially extending not the executive order, but this exception or codifying the exception, the Open Public Meetings Act anchor requirement, so people could continue with electronic meetings. But at this point in yellow, it's really up to your best judgment implementing those guidelines and what your capabilities are. Brandy, anything you want to add to Mayor KJ's question about OPMA?
No, that sounds good. And we also had the question about discretion from local elected officials. And I think that the Lieutenant Governor answered it very well in saying that there's a collaborative approach, and there are times when the guidelines just are not real clear. And so, I do think using best judgment is important. And well, I'll just remember the social distancing, the hygiene efforts, but do the best we can, because the guidelines just cannot contemplate every single situation.
Okay, the next question is about bonding for B and C. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I don't know that we've seen the current projections. We've been told that maybe it was actually a little bit better than originally had been anticipated. Have you seen anything more recent, Cam, relative to anticipated shortfalls?
Yeah, so Garth, your number is consistent with what we were hearing a few weeks ago, but the numbers that we got from the tax commission the other day showed a decrease in motor fuel tax revenue year over year from March of 13%. April will be a bigger number because the traffic decreased substantially in April compared to March, but May's numbers, people are driving again, and so you may not see the same dip that we previously anticipated. So it's hard to say exactly. The one good data point we have is 13% for March, and stay tuned for April. So on the data piece, that's the answer. On the bonding piece, Brandy, at this point, last week's bond was not about B and C. The one last thing I'll add there, Garth, is this is in part why UAC and the league are sending the letter to state leaders, is to point out that there is going to be a shortfall in the B and C fund. We're also sharing that information with the federal delegation. So as they're looking at a fourth stimulus and potentially an infrastructure investment, they have that data point to know where we would be, where we are anticipating a shortfall. So Mayor Young, football and yellow, opinion on contact sports in yellow. The guidelines, the 4.4 guidelines just came out on Friday and have some updates on team sports. We had an internal working group that was working on recommendations for team sports, then we sent to the governor's office for their consideration, trying to identify which types of team sports could be played under orange, which ones could be played under yellow, which ones needed to wait until green. Football being the biggest contact sport of all, we always were operating on the premise that it would be green, but the 4.4 guidelines may actually allow for team sports, contact sports like football. So take a look at those 4.4 guidelines. The governor's order on Friday incorporated the 4.4 guidelines, and those guidelines are what are being looked at almost on a daily basis. And so it's the same thing for the mass gathering question from Mayor Caldwell. We're getting feedback from members, sending it to the commission and the governor's office, and then they update those guidelines. Brandy, you're involved in that process too. What are your thoughts around both team sports, the baseball attendance, and mass gatherings, like Mayor Caldwell's question?
Yeah, so I've actually heard of some increased activity even over the weekend, and as much as we certainly want to see those activities happen and think that it would be good for all of us for many reasons, not just the economic side of it, but also the social aspect and mental health aspect of it. Let's just hope that the data continues to be at the rate where it is, and that we don't see spikes as a result of people getting out more. I'm optimistic, and certainly want to see more of those type of activities with caution. Of course, I think that, these things can happen. So we'll see how things go, but I know that we'll be watching it very closely to see as people are getting out more, if the data indicates that maybe there are potential problems, and we may see certain areas where, and we'll learn from the way that these things are being conducted. I'm aware of a specific event that happened in Miller County over the weekend, and I think that those who are organizing those events are absolutely being very conscientious and thoughtful as to the way that they can conduct those things in a safe manner, including requiring online registration and other things. So I applaud those that are involved in those efforts to be creative so that we can see these things happen and still maintain good numbers in the data benchmarks that we're monitoring.
Thank you, Brandy. And Mayor Caldwell, specifically to your question on mass gatherings, the organizers of the Pioneer Day celebration canceled, not because of the health guidelines per se, but because of the uncertainty and needing to make decisions based on contracts. We've had an internal work group that's been providing recommendations to the governor's office. The 4.3 guidelines, which were the guidelines we were operating under at the beginning of last week, precludes a county from issuing a permit for mass gatherings above a certain size. And 4.4, which came out, I don't recall what provision was in there. John Park, you're in as a panelist, so if you have that answer, feel free to chime in. But if not, we can follow up on that to see if that restriction was still in 4.4, and we anticipate a 4.5 and a 4.6 and others as we go along here. So, at this point, because of that prohibition at the state level on those large event gathering permits, you have to take that into consideration when you're planning summer mass events. That said, a lot of groups are still trying to go forward planning the large events with the expectation that that prohibition will be changed in the next couple of weeks as the health data improves. So I wish I had a more definitive answer for you. I get this question probably more than any other question as of late. Everybody's trying to make it a summer to remember and save the 4th of July to some degree. So we are relaying those concerns up the chain of command and really waiting on the health data to lead to that state decision. Brandy, any other thoughts just on those county permits and mass gatherings?
No, I will say that I had a phone call earlier this morning from a member asking for some better clarification on the process for permitting. And so we'll be working on that as well, just to make sure that there's clear understanding for the process for that.
Perfect. And it looks like Dave Erickson said he loves the idea of going 100% green. Oh, John, go ahead. What did you say?
No, I've been trying to figure that out as well. I know that the team sports, as you mentioned earlier, has changed on 4.4, and but I don't have the answer to that. But I'll bring it up and see if I can find something before you shut down. Okay,
perfect. If not, we'll follow up. Mayor Caldwell will follow up not just with you personally, but with our communication channels. So in closing, looks like Dave Erickson said, I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I love the idea of going 100% green. Well, you've now written that down. You are now quoted, and it's preserved for all posterity. But I think you speak for all of us that we are anxiously awaiting the day that we are all 100% green. So with that, Brandy, thank you very much. Great to see you as always. And thank you everybody for joining the conversation with the Lieutenant Governor, and we'll chat with you soon. Thanks.
Thanks so much.